we have another remote presentation today. This one will be from Amelie-Sophie Vavrovsky, and she'll be doing hers. She's actually on Zoom right now, so we'll have again an opportunity to ask questions via Zoom afterwards. In the interest of time, we're going to hold it to 2 questions per presentation, just so that we can finish on time. And I will just remind you one more time: the party after starting at 3 o'clock downstairs in Y2E 226 is going to be a great opportunity again to continue those conversations if you don't get your question in just now. But I'll turn it over to Amelie.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Is the audio okay? Yes. Okay, great. I see thumbs up. I'm really excited to be talking to you all about algorithmic food justice. Clearly, can you all hear me okay? Is the audio okay? Yes. Okay, great. I see thumbs up. I'm really excited to be talking to you all about algorithmic food justice. Clearly can now see there's already a typo in my title slide, so I apologize for that. But we'll move on. My background is, first let me start with an agenda. There's quite a few things to cover today. One is just the introduction. I will also try to give everyone a 30-second primer on blockchain, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Then the definition of AFJ, why should we care about algorithmic food justice, the basic overview of the literature, the theoretical framework I use, some methods, and opportunity analysis, and then some outcomes and analysis as well. My name is Amelie. I'm a dual degree student in international policy and E-IPER, and in my policy degree, my focus has been on digital rights and cyber policy. So I'm really interested in how policy, technology, and sustainability interact with each other. And I'm also a big supply chain nerd, so I spend a lot of time tracking supply chains of fisheries as an undergrad. And this project allows me to combine all my interests in terms of policy, technology, and then also sustainability. So to give everyone the quickest, dirtiest explanation of blockchain and how you could maybe think about it while we look at this algorithmic food justice issue, is if, like, on the blockchain, especially if it's a public blockchain, if I give an apple, say to Stephanie, and Stephanie has now the apple in her hand, then everyone in the room where you're sitting would say, Amelie gave Stephanie the apple. So if I asked you where the apple is, you would all know that it's with Stephanie. So it's sort of a really simplified way of thinking about it, but that's what makes it so secure, is that everyone now has this information. It's public, and that's why it's hard to change and kind of more immutable. And then algorithmic food justice takes the application of algorithms and data-driven technologies like blockchains to achieve more equitable and just food systems. And it's a really emerging new field. And in my Capstone project, I was really interested in what are the opportunities, if any, that we could explore to make algorithmic justice more of a reality. And why should we care about this? I think that blockchain specifically, has the potential, again, we still have to think about it critically, but has the potential to make supply chains more traceable and more transparent. And it could also potentially enable consumers to make more values-driven purchasing decisions and allow them to shape corporate decision-making through things like DAOs, which are ways to, they're sort of like decentralized governance mechanisms that you could use to help people make decisions along their values. And the literature on like AFJ, again, is pretty emerging, but what I found when I looked into the broad literature on blockchain and food supply systems is there's a lot of literature on there's a lot of literature on blockchain and transparency, but there's a little bit on algorithmic food justice, a little bit on blockchain, and then also there are some case studies, but the case studies are actually some of the least developed. So definitely something to keep in mind is that this hasn't been studied very well just yet. In terms of a theoretical framework, what AFJ really looks at is 2 things. So there's this thing called more than human factors, which is a bit of a misnomer because it does also include some human factors, but really what this is trying to capture is things like labor conditions, impact on biodiversity, carbon emissions, pollution, right? So all of these things that we know are negative externalities in our food system, but they're really difficult to measure and really difficult to trace from a consumer perspective, especially. And then so I'm going to dive deep into what those more than human factors are, and also which have the highest potential. And then the second part of my theoretical framework really looks at opportunity analysis. So trying to quantify and qualify some of these human factors and see which ones are most useful to look at when we look at algorithmic food justice and the potential implementation of it. So to dive into the more than human factors, I tried to look at a very, very large amount of these potential factors. And I think, as you think about it, you can probably think of about 20 yourself, but they generally fall into 4 buckets. So one is labor and rights, which includes how farm workers are treated, general labor rights, immigration rights, gender equity, wage equality, indigenous folks' rights. Then there's another bucket that I call natural factors, which again, this is not an exclusive list or exhaustive list, which is degradation of soils, loss of biodiversity and species loss. And then there's also climate factors, which again focuses on carbon emissions from tilling and farming, animal emissions, and then also emissions from food transportation. And then there's also what I call chemical factors, which has pollution, chemical leakage, and damage to water, air, and soil. So I try to simplify this a little bit in my analysis, just to have us put it together in a slightly easier way. In terms of when I did more in-depth analysis, and we'll get into the analysis in just a bit, but I think it was important to highlight what algorithmic food justice compatibility means. So really what I'm talking about is what more than human factors could we look at as being potentially viable to implement at a larger scale, right? And then what makes it more compatible? Well, there's a few criteria that emerged. One is around, is it easily measurable? Is it affordable and relatively objective? The next is around, and so that includes things like satellite data, like customs data or air quality data, because those are relatively available and well measured. Something that might be less compatible is something that really relies on human input and is costly to measure. And then lastly, I think there's also just a notion that it's really hard to measure some of these variables. So if there's if there are few or bad proxy variables, that also tends to make it less compatible. And I think this will make a little bit more sense when I show you the analysis I did. But I just wanted to give this primer of how I made my decisions around what would be a compatible thing to measure. And what I did specifically was to create an analytical framework for measuring and comparing AFJ compatibility through literature and feasibility analysis. Okay, so let's start back with these more than human factors. I looked at a few more than those 4 buckets because it was, again, even in the buckets, they were too hard to analyze. So I singled some that I think were key out here. So that includes labor rights, indigenous rights, biodiversity loss, degradation of soil quality, soil carbon emissions from tilling and farming, animal emissions, CO2 emissions, pollution, and then also waste. So how to measure / potential proxy variables. We looked at, those are some potential ways to measure. You don't have to read all of this. I know the slide is pretty heavy, and I will highlight some important ones. So I looked at how to measure it. And then I also looked at blockchain compatibility, and then I gave it a little explanation of why it is high, low, or medium compatible. To highlight a few that are more compatible. So degradation of soil quality, you can measure chemical and physical indicators. You can do small size runoff plot tests, runoff plot erosion tests, and field size erosion tests. The reason I thought this was relatively easy to measure is because it's easy and objective, right? You can actually run these tests. They're relatively well established. Another one that I thought was relatively easy to measure was pollution, right? So looking at pesticides in the soil, air, and water, again, relatively easy to measure. You can have a sensor that sort of detects what's going on here. Something that's really hard to measure, as we know and have heard a lot about, CO2 emissions from food transportation, is really difficult to measure if there's not a good framework on how to actually do carbon accounting. So thank you, Abby and Eric for doing that amazing work. So in terms of finding opportunities in this space, again, it's still very early, and I want to be really clear that, this is by no means done, but really the things to look for are reliably measurable factors. So one of the big takeaways really is that solutions that focus on highly measurable, more than human factors will be much easier to implement. The next takeaway is that starting small is really important. So when I did my interviews with suppliers, they were like, yeah, I mean, we could try it on one product. But even then it seems difficult, but starting small with maybe like one berry at Driscoll's might be a potential way to do it. But the more stakeholders you add, the harder implementation becomes. Another opportunity that came out of this, I think, is actually around DAOs and decentralized government. I think this has been super underexplored, but allowing people to basically have tokens and vote on which of these factors are most important to them, even to just have incremental changes in behavior and make values-driven decisions emerges as an opportunity in my mind. And then the last thing is like you need corporate buy-in at all levels. Like you cannot implement this in the way that you would implement like certification systems. You need to really have people buy into this at this point from where we're at. So again, I think, when we look at this is like the big opportunities and outcomes are like, yeah, transparency is a really amazing opportunity of this concept of algorithmic food justice if we can find factors that are easily measurable. And then again, back into the value-driven consumer decision-making. I think that's a big opportunity that came out of this work that I did last quarter. There's still a lot of uncertainty and risk, right? Like this industry is in its infancy. We don't really have perfect ways of measuring things that we really care about. But the more we work on those, the easier that's going to get. And then there's also a lot of things that are expensive and difficult to measure, as well as a lot of uncertainty around how much consumers actually care. From the research I did, consumers say they care a lot, but I think we would need to do more analysis to really see and would love to take any questions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Amelie. This is John.
Hey, John.
If you had to start small, what would you start with? And I'm curious why.
I thought about this a lot, and I thought about this question a lot. So I think from what I can tell right now is that Whole Foods, like not Whole Foods the company, but like produce, for instance, is an easier place to start because it like touches fewer actors along the supply chain. It just has a less complicated like supply chain. So I think like maybe starting on something like a strawberry farm in Salinas, if you live in California, might be a much more feasible thing to do than to try to trace. And you and I talked about this, right? Like beef from Latin America, right? Or even worse, something like sausages or processed food. I think that's going to get much, much more difficult and complicated. So I think I would start with something like that. Like, maybe like the Driscoll strawberries in Salinas, maybe something like that, and try to get Driscoll on board. So I would try to find something that is like that. Maybe even better would be like an organic Driscoll strawberry that consumers already buy because they want to make ethical decisions, right? So using something that is maybe more of a luxury good that people don't need to buy but make a decision to buy is probably another good place to start.
Thank you. This was so interesting. I have a question about how you decided what things counted as human versus, say, more than human factors, or I don't know, outside of the human scope. In particular, things like labor rights and indigenous rights seem like human factors to me. So I was just curious what your decision-making criteria were when you were trying to think through those various variables and dimensions.
Yeah, so the literature calls them more than human factors. Like there's like one seminal paper on AFJ that calls them more than human factors. But I think it was important in that concept. They also wrap in human factors, but it basically, I think this is not a great name. I think we should change it. But I think it's important to consider all the things that we would think of maybe in environmental science as negative externalities of the food production system, right? That includes things that affect animals and biodiversity and air quality and pollution, et cetera. So I think that how we treat our workers also is an important thing to consider when we make ethical decisions along the food supply chain. So I thought it was really important to wrap those factors in and still evaluate them, even if it doesn't make the theory quite so neat, because the whole point of trying to do something like this is, I think, to have a more ethical, transparent food system where we can account for those things that classic certification schemes really don't show you, right? I think certification is so narrow. So if we could actually have algorithmic food justice implemented in a meaningful way, you could have even things like scorecards, right? Like, how did it score on these different factors, right? How did it score on each of the 4 buckets? And I think that starts to become exciting and transparent for a consumer that is trying to make ethics-driven decisions. Thank you so much.